The number of people who came together to build this program sat on a Zoom, because of course it was Zoom, around February and said, oh my goodness, there are so many things that we could be bringing to the participants, and how on earth are we going to build something that has a narrative flow, that isn't overwhelming, and that doesn't necessarily address everything that's important to us, but really touches the highlights. I called Robin Hack, who is the founder and CEO of an organization called the Center for Community Investment, because I and another person in the room, Ursula Bischoff, had the pleasure and the honor of participating in a learning cohort about their capital absorption model and the ways in which the Center for Community Investment is working across the country to make sure that there are communities, especially in metro regions, but not exclusively in metro regions, that understand how to create enabling environments for project pipelines for economic and workforce and community development that are grounded in equity, that apply a racial equity lens in particular, and that figure out ways for people to make collective decisions about how to undertake complex projects, bring in the dollars, and to do so in a way that allows for time. So I'm so thrilled. Robin said, let me ask Omar if he's free. Omar said, I'm in a conference and I'm teaching back-to-back that week. I'll do what I can. And then he said yes. So on their own dime, they came on up. He came in yesterday from teaching all day. And he's going to talk with us now about his work in communities across the country. What Omar does as the Director of Partnerships and Initiatives for the Center for Community Investment is he develops and leads initiatives that support local stakeholders to advance their community's priorities. That sounds pretty generic, but we're going to find out just how powerful it can be. He's previously worked in housing, health, and community development policy in Oregon, so overlapping community contexts. And he's super smart and fancy. He's got a master's in urban planning from Harvard and a bachelor's from Princeton. One of the things that I want you to know is that Humboldt Area Foundation, AEDC, and others are interested in deepening our understanding of this capital absorption model and of the ways in which we can create enabling environments for these kinds of projects. If you want to be a learning partner in that, you know how to get a hold of us. Please reach out if you want to learn more afterwards, and we'll see what we can do together. Omar, thank you for your patience. Thank you for traveling from LA. Come on up.
All right. Well, thank you for that great introduction, Layla. I am so excited to be here and really happy that we were able to make this work, and really thankful for the opportunity to be here and share what we're up to and a little bit about our work. So it was actually a great introduction into our work the past couple of sessions this morning. I chuckled when I saw that Nick flashed the Canavan framework earlier on and said the recovery work fell in the chaotic bucket, because then with Dr. Ehler's presentation, we moved into the complex, right? And I think that's really where our work operates as well, and moving from that complexity into figuring out how do we make these different systems work. So we ended, or part of the last presentation, we talked about how difficult it is to make capital flow to the kinds of projects, the kinds of things that our community wants and needs, right? And I think there were some comments that were pointing to why there's a lot of difficulty in doing that. And when we started the center about 7 years ago, we were looking around and we were seeing that making any one of these projects that we care about come to life felt like a heroic journey. For whom does that resonate when you really want either an affordable housing deal, a grocery store, a small business consortium to work? it feels like you're running from place to place, you're gathering resources, and it takes a really long time. It takes a heroic effort, really, from so many folks. It takes so much time. It takes so much energy. It takes going from one city department to one county department to a state agency. We know that this gets us those projects built because we are resilient, strong, heroic people who care a lot about our communities. And we also know that after we celebrate that one project, we're like, and there's more. And then we embark in the next heroic journey, right? And that has really been the history of community investment. So in this country, as we were saying earlier, we operate under this capitalistic model. That's how our economy works. Next slide, Leila. And what that means is that capital flows to easier deals, right? We like to say that capital flows downhill. It flows to the places where investors see that they're going to have a return on their investment or a perceived return on their investment, and where the risk or the perceived risk is lower. So that's what they're looking at. And capital can flow all day to those kinds of projects. And what we know is that the kinds of projects that we care about, that our communities need, that we want, that benefit people with low incomes, people with low wealth, people in more rural regions, people who are living in the kinds of communities that are left behind and have historically been left behind by the system, need projects, need investments that don't fit that model of quick returns, and that where the perception of risk, whether real or not, is higher, and so we don't get that capital flowing. And so we've developed this community investment system. I think we have folks from CDFIs here. Can I see who's with the CDFI? Yeah, so we have folks who are creating a different way of making that money flow uphill, right? And next slide, please. What we know is that oftentimes, to continue with this extended analogy, that feels like we're getting a bucket, we're running it up the hill, and then we get there and we get that project done, and then we have to go all the way down the hill again, another bucket to get that other project done. And so the Center for Community Investment looked around and said, how can we start systematizing a way of doing this? So how can we move from moving buckets of water up the hill to thinking about irrigation systems, to thinking about pumps, to make more deals happen? And that is quite the endeavor, right? Because there are so many forces, as we heard in the previous conversation, that make it really difficult for that. But we also know that there are a good amount of us, a lot of us in this room from this region, who really care about making this pump system work so that we're not all running with our bucket down the hill to bring capital, to bring investments to those projects that we care about. Next slide. And so essentially what we're after here is asking this question, which is taking on this endeavor, which is a pretty ambitious endeavor of moving the community investment system, the community development system, those of us who want more capital to flow to those projects, to move from thinking about one deal, one transaction at a time, to thinking about pipelines of deals, to moving from a transactional focus to an ecosystem focus, right? We've heard a lot about partnerships, about collaboration. So what does that look like for us to think about systems, to think about pipelines of deals? And I'll get to what I mean by that in a minute. To move from single projects and gap filling to really thinking about community visions, right? To really thinking about, rather than one business, to thinking about corridors, to thinking about regional development. If we're really going to move into this blue economy, what does that mean for the people who have been here who care a lot about this place to benefit from that, and how do we start activating that vision with them at the center. And finally, moving from the technical siloed components to really navigating those adaptive challenges. One of the things that, again, I heard in the last conversation is how quickly things become political, right? And what that really means is how quickly it becomes about confronting the values that we hold, the histories that we're holding, both as individuals and also as communities. And the work of adaptive leadership in doing this together in an adaptive way to say, how can we bridge those and collaborate to work together? And how can we move the community investment system to just thinking about how do we finance this one project to thinking, how do we bring this vision to life? And what do we need to do to cobble our resources together and to create that force that'll get us there? So ambitious, I know. It's a big, lofty goal. And from working across the country, we saw that there were 3 functions that we kept seeing over and over. And once we categorized them in this way, and now it seems kind of an obvious thing, this idea of capital absorption, which comes from the notion that a lot of us were spending a lot of time thinking about how do we bring that capital to our places. And what we were seeing is that the folks who were successful at bringing those investments were also thinking about how do we build those projects and have those projects ready to absorb the capital. There were so many times when advocates would push their state legislatures, would push their counties to allocate funds, would even fundraise funds from impact investors, and then would have a hard time figuring out how to deploy them into projects. Does that sound like a familiar? Yeah. And so we see it across, right, where we land this big policy win and we're really excited because it means that we're going to get millions of dollars into our region, or we find impact investors who are saying, okay, fine, we're willing to take a lower return on our investment because we care about the other kinds of impact that our investment is having. And then we're having a really hard time finding the projects that can actually absorb that capital. And what that led us is to create this capital absorption framework. And through this framework, we began to see that if there were these 3 functions, so the first, folks coming together around a shared priority. And what we mean by a shared priority is not just a vision, like we all want all the children in our region to be healthy and to have great educational outcomes. And we don't necessarily mean a project either. We want to bring a grocery store to the corner of Main and 5th because we know we need a grocery store there. But how can we find that altitude where it's enough for us to come together and make decisions about the path that we want to follow, and is also able to inspire us to continue to work together towards a common goal. So we saw that across the country, folks that were successful in bringing capital had this clear articulation of a shared priority. Then the second function is a pipeline of projects. And those pipeline of projects actually relate to that shared priority, right? And it sounds not true when I say it, but sometimes we have worked with communities where they say, what we really need is more housing, or what we really need is to understand how to deal with the changing climate, because we keep getting wrecked by storms that flood our places, and that's really affecting us. But then we look at what's happening in the community investment system and what projects are getting funded and capitalized, and there's a mismatch there, right? we say we want housing, but all the projects that we're seeing are around something else, a different priority. And so what we mean by create a pipeline of projects is not just thinking about the single project, but thinking about what set of projects together is going to actually make a difference in moving towards that shared priority. And then the third is the enabling environment, and Leila alluded to this. So in order to make these deals work, we know that there are a whole host of contexts, of contextual things that are happening in the environment in which we want these deals to work, whether they are policy things, whether they're regulatory things. Sometimes they're even just platforms, the realization that actually we don't have a space like this where we can come together and interact, and what it will actually make, not transform our region overnight, but what will actually make a difference in having these projects move is if we had the chance to interact more and talk to each other about what our goals are and begin that alignment. So maybe even just building a platform as an enabling environment move is important and needed. So just to get a little bit deeper into those three functions, and I'll tell a story to bring it to life. So we won't stay in just this conceptual framework, I promise. But the first, the shared priority. So legitimately and widely embraced. These are the elements that make a successful shared priority, at least as we've seen across the country. The second, focused on racial equity and the system. We had, I think, a couple of comments in the audience about making sure that folks who have historically been left out, folks who have suffered from structural racism, redlining, all of the policies and procedures and culture that have historically left them out and continue to leave our folks out are included and centered in our strategy. Third, that it's straightforward. So if we have one-page shared priority, it's going to be really hard to galvanize people around that, right? Fourth, appropriately specific and timely. So it matters to the folks in our region. It matters to the people whose lives we care about. So what does that look like? Next slide. We think that a shared priority has two things. So you bring all of your visions, you bring all of that work that I'm sure you have done multiple times around asking around, looking at the data, asking folks, what do you want? What do you need in your community? We're really good at doing that. And then really taking that alongside our partners and developing two things, an aspiration and a result. And an aspiration is really what is the difference that we want to make for the population that we care about, right? And that result is something concrete. And then what will that look like on the ground? How will we get there? Next slide. So I'll give you an example of what this can look like. How many of you are familiar with the Coachella Valley region? Yeah. So Coachella Valley region in Southern California, very famous for some things like the Coachella Festival, like a lot of very rich people having second and third homes in Palm Springs and Indian Wells, a lot of golf tournaments. But what we also know is the reality in the Coachella Valley is that all of that industry, all of that wealth is supported by a lot of workers, right? A lot of workers who are working in farms, who are working in the agricultural sector, and a lot of service workers that are providing that vacation experience for a lot of folks as well. And what's also true in the Coachella Valley, like most places in California at this point and everywhere across the country, is that they're facing significant rent burden. Folks are paying a lot more of their income on housing, which leaves little on the table for other things like food and medicine and all those good things that we need. The the organization that we've been working with there had been convening folks and asking around, like, what will make a difference in your life? What do you really care about? And everyone kept pointing back to housing being such an issue. And this is, no surprise to most of us in the room. And they were hearing this not only from folks living in the suburban areas in the Palm Springs, but they were also hearing this from other folks in the region. Farm workers were also having a hard time finding affordable housing in the more rural parts of that region. And at the same time, and again, this is a familiar story, national and statewide community development financial institutions, the public sector, philanthropy, was showing little interest in that area, right? They were, when folks looked at the numbers and saw how much was going to other places, to the LA metro area, to San Francisco, a lot of philanthropy wasn't reaching the Coachella Valley at all, despite both the challenges in how much wealth is also concentrated there. And then the other thing about Coachella, and again, this might sound really familiar, it's politically complex, like most places, most regions. It is made up of 9 small cities, so it includes Palm Springs, Rancho Mirage, Indian Wells, Coachella, a bunch of others, and it also has a bunch of unincorporated areas. And each city has its own processes. The county has its own processes. The unincorporated areas work with the county sometimes do their own thing. And so they looked around, and as they were seeing that housing was an issue that they wanted to work on, we're like, how do we bring folks together in this? And so they created their shared priorities. So when we started working with them in 2017, we pushed them to really articulate a shared priority. What does that look like? What is the aspiration? And you'll see here, this is a little bit more simply stated, but it's not much more verbose than this. The aspiration was simply to reduce the number of burdened families by 1/3, by 30%. And they were going to do that. The result was that they were going to make sure that they were going to either preserve or create 10,000 houses, 10,000 units in the valley by 2030. Ambitious, right? So that is what their shared priority looked like. And just to give you a little bit more context about what went into that, you'll see that part of why they were successful in getting to the shared priority is they created this collaborative, and this collaborative included all these organizations that came together, and that included the cities, the county, the nonprofit organizations, the couple of developers that existed in the region, and others, and said, this is a problem for all of us. This is a regional economic problem. Folks are having a hard time attracting folks to the workforce, as we've heard today, also very familiar here. And folks are leaving our area because housing is really expensive. So we need to come together and do something about that. And so how they did that is they created a pipeline. And so a few things about what we have seen a pipeline of projects look like. So a pipeline is useful because it lets you see all the opportunities, right? And so rather than each organization or each city having their set of projects, 1 or 2 that they might have been working on, or a developer having some projects that they might be working on, elevating to the level of pipeline, they were able to see what the patterns were. Where in the region are these projects supposed to happen? Where are we seeing gaps? What kinds of projects are we seeing? We've brought together this coalition that includes folks from the suburban areas, and we've brought folks from the more rural areas, and the kinds of housing that they need, as we know, are different. And so how do we make sure that as we move forward, we're including that? And so that's one benefit of thinking in terms of a pipeline. The other is it ensures that you're actually advancing towards that shared priority, right? When we have the projects scattered around, it's a little bit more difficult to say we've moved towards that result that we've set. The third is reducing cost and increasing inefficiencies. That I think is a little obvious. And the fourth and fifth, I think, are really important. And really, if we're going to shift the system, it gets us to the enabling environment. And by working at that pipeline level, again, we're able to say, all of those deals keep getting stuck in the same place. They're running into the same permitting process at the county. What is up with that? That is adding a whole 8 months, a whole year where the project can't move forward because they're running into permitting issues. And we now are seeing that with 4 or 5 of these deals and probably more. They're also seeing funding gap, funding sources that don't align. So we're waiting for the city to put forward this RFP for funding. And even though we've secured county funding for 6 months now, and so now we're just sitting on this project to see if we can get this other bucket of money, because that's how we make projects come together, right? Who has experience with that? Does that sound familiar? Yeah, exactly. And so by having that pipeline level, they're able to notice where things keep getting stuck. Next slide. And so to give you an idea of what they came up with is the pipeline, and so make it come to life of what it looks like. It was really important, again, to the folks in the Coachella Valley that the pipeline include projects across the region, and so that it wasn't just more affordable housing developments in the city of Coachella, where historically more affordable housing developments have happened, and not in Indian Wells, where historically they haven't happened. How do we make sure that we're thinking about that word again, equity, this time in terms of regional equity, and how do we make sure that as we bring more of these homes to life, the folks are able to live in different parts of our region, not just in the outskirts, not just in one city and not another. And so as they were developing the pipeline of deals and looking out, it gave them an opportunity to, again, see in real time where they had projects and where they didn't. The other thing to notice here is that they developed a criteria for projects, and this is simplified, but it was, is the project going to actually contribute to reducing rent burden? How does the project advance racial equity? And where is the project in terms of readiness? And by having this criteria that was directly coming from their shared priority, they were able to really focus and narrow in on what happened. And I want to be clear that this was months and years in the making. When they first started, some developers were like, why would we share our portfolio of projects with you? That doesn't make any business sense to us. Our competitors are then going to be able to see what we have. And other folks were saying, you're selling us a pipe dream, literally. This isn't going to happen. And so going back to this concept of moving away from the technical and into the adaptive was a critical path of getting there. So the backbone organization, Lift to Rise, and the county kept coming back and assuring folks that information that they shared was going to be protected and ways that needed to be protected, continuing to build the relationship, continuing to create those platforms for folks to come together. And if they weren't ready to share about one specific project, they were able to share what challenges they were running into. And so it was a process in the making of developing this pipeline. One thing that was a significant step forward was getting folks to agree to even develop a public database of what projects were coming online to move in that direction. And that created a level of accountability as well for the Backbone organization. And to the point of making sure that folks felt like this was actually an initiative worth contributing to, worth staying there for. How many of us have been part of initiatives where we feel like we just go to meetings and nothing really happens, and we just keep going to meetings? Maybe not here. Maybe you all have very successful meetings and action gets completed and things move forward quickly. But in most other places, there are a lot of initiatives that come and go, and folks are like, not again. And so it was really important for them, as they thought about this regional pipeline of projects, to deliver, and to deliver quickly, but also to think about how do you do that in a way that signals what we're about. And so as part of this pipeline of projects, they had a first batch of projects. They were really intentional about what it was going to signal. And one thing that it was going to signal is that we're not just talking about multifamily development in one part of the region. We also have farm worker housing, because we know that's really important, and we have Polanco parks that are going to benefit important constituency to this region and to this collaborative. And we're also going to signal that this is not just about putting more affordable housing in the city of Coachella. This is also about putting affordable housing in places where we usually don't see it. And so you'll see in this first batch of projects that they started to signal that. So then that gets us into the enabling environment. And again, enabling environment is the context in which all of this is happening and our ability to influence that environment. And so there are a few ways that we have and that we've categorized to do that. Most people immediately go to policy, and that is obviously a very important tool that we have. But there are multiple other ways that we can influence the environment in which these deals can come to life, and can come to life faster, and can come to life with more impact, and can come to life in a way that is actually benefiting the folks that we want to benefit. And that includes looking at institutional practices, right? So what is happening from the city? So again, moving back to the example of permitting, what this regional collaborative was able to do is say, it doesn't make sense that in this region, we have all these small cities, and they all have different processes. So if I'm a developer coming in from outside of town, or even from the region, I have to figure out how to navigate the process that Palm Springs has, which is different than the process that the city of Coachella has, which is different than the process that another city has, and then the county has a whole other process. And so how can we streamline that process and make it so that folks have a similar process? And how do we bring in city staff to propose to their elected officials this way of working that's actually not only a benefit to the city, but to the region as a whole, because they're so intertwined, right? The third is locating additional sources of funding, which is, again, what we often solely focus on. It's very important, and I don't want to disregard that. But part of what they saw was by having this regional approach, and I'll share a little bit about our experience in Appalachia, where by having this shared priority, they were actually able to think about locating pools of funding differently because they were able to attract national funders who would otherwise be like, small city, where is this project? Your project needs 500,000. I'm looking for projects that need $5 million. And so now by operating at this pipeline level, part of the enabling environment shift is you can say, I have a $5 million project for you. It's going to be split up once I get that 5 million, but that's none of your concern. We'll get you the return that you need, and we can absorb that capital. So that's what we mean by locating additional sources of funding. Ensuring availability of needed skills and capacities. And that was huge also in the Coachella Valley. One of the things that they found as they were working with us is that there actually wasn't any community development financial institution that lent to housing projects in that region. And so for every project that was getting constructed, they needed to attract someone from San Diego or from LA to come do that project. And of course, there's like multiple projects that those folks can be funding to. So if we go back to capital flowing to where it's easiest, even in our community investment system, capital is going to flow to where it's easiest. And so the question became, how do we either grow that capacity or incentivize folks to move and to do projects here? Fostering formal and informal relationships. I've talked a little bit about that already. Building forums and platforms for ongoing collaboration, and shifting narratives. And that's, of course, a critical part of the work that we're all engaged with on a daily basis. So convincing political leaders that this is worth investing in, that these people who live in our communities also need to be getting the resources from the state, from the national government that is going to other places. So how do we shift the narrative around, actually, this is worth investing in, and we know it because we live here and we care about this community. So there was a lot of storytelling that was part of their work. Next slide. So they thought of their enabling environment as having these 3 different strategies. They focused on investment. They built a fund, and often times when I talk about what folks do and I say they built a fund, they're like, that's what we got to do. We got to build a fund. But I want to emphasize that they only built a fund after they had both developed this shared priority and had a pipeline of projects to absorb the capital for that fund, and were able to structure that fund in a way that actually met the demands of what those projects that they had were. There have been time and time again in our field where we build a fund and then we have a hard time finding the projects, and that's because we don't have a pipeline of projects to absorb the capital in that fund, because the rates are not what the project can absorb, the kinds of money that it is different. And so by creating the demand alongside building the fund, they were able to think about what that match would be and could be. And they were able to think creatively about how to mix different kinds of capital into the mix, building capital stack, which is a fancy thing that people in the finance world use to just mean bringing together grants and loans with different expectations of returns coming together and blending them to make projects work, which is a lot of what folks in the community investment system world end up doing as part of that bucket uphill work. But if we're doing it at the pipeline level, we're able to bring more projects into life rather than spending all of that time and energy putting together a capital stack for the one project, right? They also focused on policy, some of the local policy. So I've mentioned some of the work that they did with the cities and the permitting processes. And resident engagement, and I know it's listed here. I don't want to throw that just out there. It was part of their success really centered on how intentional they were from the beginning. Because if you remember, the shared priority and the results really came from the engagement. And throughout, they were really intentional about keeping their resident table alongside the partnership that they've built, including in making pipeline decisions about which projects from that fund get the investment. They've created a mechanism where instead of the capital being decided and the projects that are capitalized being decided solely by the investors, the community residents have a say in how that capital flows. So part of understanding how we get to that system level required understanding about how a project actually moves from beginning to end, right? And so we broke that down into several steps. And I won't go through each into detail, but you'll see that part of the first step is really identifying or spotting the opportunity. And there are folks in every community. I'm sure you have neighbors, maybe you're one yourself, that you're driving around town and you're like, you know what would be really cool there? A movie theater, because X, Y, and Z. You know what would be really great there is an apartment complex, because actually this is has the kinds of things where it wouldn't disrupt the flow of how the community feels if we built a little bit higher, because we have the density to support that. You know, there are folks in all of our communities who are such good spotters. And they do that, and we rely on having that vision as a first step. Like, what can happen in that space? What could that look like? And then we need framers. And that's folks who can say, okay, let's take that dream of what can happen in that one place in the neighborhood and really start thinking about what do we need to actually make it happen. And some of those framers, excellent framers, are folks in our community development financial institution world, where they bring us back to the ground and then say, actually, this is how much that's going to cost. How are you going to make that happen? But by getting creative, we can start thinking about, well, if we bring in this business on the bottom floor or on the side, and or if we think about a mixed income housing thing, and if we think about it bringing pro bono architects, et cetera, you know, folks start getting creative about how to frame that project. And then it goes through the whole process of permitting and overcoming other kinds of barriers, negotiating trade-offs, and until finally you have, you're ready to break ground. And those of you who have worked on a project are very familiar with all the complications that happen from point A to point Z in this spectrum. But by breaking it down here, we saw that there are places actually in our regions that have a lot of one thing and maybe are missing something else along the spectrum. So next slide, Leila. I want to share a little bit about our work in Appalachia, and specifically in Central Appalachia, where folks have come together for many, many years to figure out what is it going to take to shift both the realities on the ground in our region and the perceptions of the reality in our region. After decades of disinvestment, the federal government and federal dollars finally started trickling in around 2015 with the announcement of the Power Initiative, right, which promised $370 million to that region. And folks had this capital absorption problem because a lot of, if you think about that spectrum, a lot of the capacities were stripped away from that region over time. And so suddenly having the idea of where are we going to put the $370 million became concrete and real. And it wasn't going to be enough. And so they came together in a very similar way and started asking, so if our shared priority is to support local businesses, to support local projects in these four categories here, what is it going to take? What is missing? And what they found that one of the critical components, because they had some CDFIs, they had folks that could, if they had the capital, put the projects together. But one thing that was missing was framers. So we go back to they had folks who could envision a different reality for their main streets. They had folks who could negotiate the trade-offs. They'd done that before. But framing those projects and doing it at a corridor level was part of what they were missing. And so they started bringing folks together to create capacity and training to do that. And then they also realized that part of the difficulty of bringing capital into the region was that the kinds of projects and the kinds of capital that they needed were misunderstood and were perceived as too small by outside investors, whether those be public, philanthropic, or impact investors. And what they needed was to create a mechanism where they could aggregate that capital and then distribute it to their local partners. And so out of this came Invest Appalachia, which now raises funds from philanthropy investors and government agencies to do just that. And so they serve as kind of a storefront for capital for that region. And they're closing on a 40 million fundraising goal as well, and have already seen significant promises from the role that can play. For example, some of the projects that they've done was a grocery store, and those of you who have tried to bring a grocery store into town know how difficult those projects can be. And we're able to do it in a way that also brought solar panels and created kind of an energy efficient model and equipment to reduce operating costs for that grocery store. In a former coal mining community in West Virginia, they supported the redevelopment of an industrial building that'll serve as a hub for green businesses. And so the kinds of projects that they're seeing are aligned with the vision that they set out. And so I want to offer those two examples as examples of what it could look like when folks come together, align, and really think about how do we move towards that shared priority, and what can we do to move from the heroic journey of the project to the coming together and moving more systematically. I'll stop there. Thank you so much. I'll take any questions. Yeah, it's a messy process. I'll start with that. And to repeat the question is, how do we get to that shared priority? What was the process that the community took to arrive at housing and that specific shared priority? So a couple things I'll say. It was a very messy process. It wasn't simple around that because we know that our communities are facing a number of challenges. And part of an exercise that or a different frameworks, we love frameworks, is something that talks about ideas, arrangements, and effects. Have you all heard about this very simple framework? So the concept is we see the effects of how we are structured, right? And that shows up either folks are living on the street because they don't have a house. Folks are having educational outcomes that we don't want to have. Folks are, I can go on and on about what the effects look like. And this very simple framework says those are the effects of arrangements that are leading to that. And we need to deal with the effects. That's the emergency that we're confronting, and we have to keep working towards that. And simultaneously, concurrently, we have to think about the arrangements that are leading to that. And then that those arrangements are underpinned by a set of ideas that we have about why we should arrange our economy in the way that we do. Why should we arrange our economy in a way that benefits huge businesses and not smaller ones? Why should we arrange our housing in a way that benefits folks who have owned single-family homes for a very long time and not folks who are renters? These are the kinds of ideas that underpin those arrangements. So part of what the Coachella Valley group in particular did was they sat with the effects. They were seeing that folks in the rural regions, their housing not only wasn't affordable, but they lacked basic infrastructure. It was flooding, they didn't have running water. And then through that, they had all the effects. And then they were like, what is leading to this? What are those arrangements? And that's where they started seeing that a lot of it came to housing affordability. They were seeing educational outcomes that were not what they wanted to see, and there were huge inequities in terms of kids of color not going to college compared to the white kids in their schools, in their neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing that's not familiar to you all. But by interrogating what arrangement can we, as a coalition, actually start to rearrange, they landed on housing. Because it wasn't only like all these effects and all these arrangements that we don't like, but then critical was, and where can we actually make a difference? Which again was a messy process in prioritizing and going in circles around where are we actually going to land. But asking those two questions was really critical. What are the arrangements we want to rearrange that are leading to these effects that will hopefully have ripple effects, not only in housing affordability, but health and education, but also where can we see a path forward as a driving question. Thank you so much for raising that. And yes, that has been part of who has been involved. And I started by talking about some of the adaptive challenges that mean working in a different way in the region. Certainly have been part of bringing folks on board and part of the coalition in and out in different ways. Because again, messiness of navigating and shifting that enabling environment has played into it, but certainly part of the of what they've been doing. But I'd love to hear more about your ideas after.
Hi, Omar. I'm
Yes.
Ursula Bischoff again for the room, and sitting with the convening team for Redwood Region RISE. Wanted to acknowledge what Layla mentioned at the top of our session, that Layla, myself, and even Megan Barbara Allende at the Mendocino Community Foundation were participating in a cohort with CCI to learn about this model. And it was very clear to us that in broad brushstrokes, the SURF grant program has elements of this approach baked in. And a lot of the work we want to do will operationalize elements of this approach. And so my question for you is, given that there's so much complexity that needs to be sorted through and a lot of different elements we need to assess across the region about the capacity we have, even to implement our planning, with certain components of this approach, what capacity would a regional convener and a fiscal agent need to be successful in operationalizing this approach? What capacity would our partners in the community need to have to be able to contribute the vision and the engagement that we need to support this kind of approach? And what's most important to start with first? Just
Yeah.
a little parting question.
I don't know that I can answer all of those questions, but what I will say is the moving. What I'm going to mess this up. I was going to talk about the law of physics, but I don't know anything about the law of physics. But anyway, it's easier to keep going when you've already started and when you're in motion, right? And so that gets to my point around going to tables, being part of initiatives where we just seem to be chatting and we have a nice conversation and then nothing happens. So I think one of the important things is staying in motion, and even one really important and critical part of the Coachella story that I didn't tell is even before they got to the pipeline, because context, this was all happening. It started in 2017, 2018, and then COVID happened. And then we were really in an emergency situation where folks just needed to stay in their house. We weren't even talking about making their house more affordable. It was, we can't pay rent because we don't have a job. And so it was a quick pivot to how do we provide and channel emergency rental assistance to folks. But what happened through that is they were able to develop the muscle of working collaboratively and bringing those residents to the table. And they did it in a way that was like not in order to get emergency rental assistance, you need to come to our table and talk to us. It was more, we want to hear from you and you are invited to be part of this. And they were surprised at how many folks wanted to be part of that resident table and wanted to, because they kept, there were leaders that naturally show up in communities and they were like, you're offering rental assistance and I can just get this money for free? Where, like, this feels like a scam. And then after, when they were like, this isn't a scam, we can trust you, they were like, and what else can you do for my community? And so they were able to use that to really bring and keep people at the table. And part of then became both like a organizing platform for them, for those residents, and then also bringing them into the decision making. So that's kind of a roundabout way of answering your question about capacity. So that's one thing I will say is just like, what are those opportunities to engage folks that are through direct service or through other ways where they're already getting engaged, and then bringing them into the initiative so that it's not, let's invite you to have yet another visioning process before they're bought into, are you actually going to make a difference? And then the second around capacity is the part of the success that the Coachella Valley folks and the Lift to Rise and Riverside County folks who are leading this had is that they saw part of their job as telling the story outside of the region, and really thinking about how do we do everything we can to start bringing resources to support this and to start telling the story. And so developing that narrative storytelling component was a big part. Like, they went to several workshops to craft the story that they were going to tell, to start bringing in some of the philanthropic funds from national foundations that they had previously not been successful at. And then the third thing I will say is the adaptive components. And it was really messy, kind of to some of the earlier questions. The process was really messy at first. There was lack of trust. There was not, the county folks didn't trust the nonprofit folks and vice versa. And navigating that, and part of building the capacity as leaders for the folks in the region was, how do we have difficult conversations and continue to align around the North Star, but also work through the challenges? As part of the work that they did with us, and they will tell you this, I'm not divulging secrets, there were times when they were like yelling at each other in trying to get to that shared priority and result. And what we've seen is that folks who are able to cut through, we all want to be nice and polite, and then we leave the room and we have separate conversations and we split. and then we come back together and we're nice and polite again. Part of what they had to develop was the capacity as leaders to have the difficult conversations and work through it, and that has yielded dividends. So that's the third thing I'll say about capacity and what it takes.
Thank you. Jen Rice, and I was so excited to see you put the emphasis on shared priority or shared purpose. On Wednesday, we talked a bit about the importance of saying yes to the mess and investing time in that upfront process, going slow to go fast, which in my career arc of trying to move away from transactional community input, community engagement that is so performative and is so indicative to me of our fear of mess, our need for control, our fear of community organizing and community-led shared interest that really can expedite the processes that we get hung up in. And so I'm just curious to hear more from you about, how you've seen, which I hear, if I'm hearing you right, you've seen that investment in that messy, upfront, candor to find that shared priority that just enables things to just rocket from there. And I'm just curious if you can talk about how disinvested, marginalized communities can really benefit from us, people in power, releasing some of that power, releasing some of that control to really get magical results. I don't know if that's...
Yeah. Have several ideas. That's a big question. But I think one of the important lessons as we've done this kind of work across the country has been that there's we talk about listening and the importance of listening. But part of that listening is interpreting what folks are saying and developing that role where we're not only interpreting, but then creating accountability mechanisms where it's like, is this how we heard? And what that looked like in the Coachella Valley was really creating that resident table where even as they brought the Low Income Investment Fund, a national CDFI, to manage their fund, they said, we want you to come and we will provide all of these deals for you, and we think it's a good business thing for you to come to our region, and we're going to provide you all these incentives for you to do that. And we don't want you to operate in the ways that we've seen you operate in other places. We will create a resident stakeholder table that's going to vet the projects that are going to go into the pipeline that you're going to invest in. And by doing that, there was actually we listened, we heard, we interpreted, this is what you need. Even though some folks have different ideas about what should happen with rural housing and don't think Polancos are the thing, there's an important constituency that says, this is important right now and we need you to pay attention to that. So they stuck to that, right? And then they were able to bring in those folks to play a role, not only in the shared priority development, which I think we've, as a field, as a nonprofit field, gotten pretty sophisticated at asking people what they want, developing visions, but also in the accountability of the projects themselves. And importantly, not requiring folks to understand the ins and outs of finance and how a project gets financed and gets done, but really like, are we meeting that result? Does this project meet the criteria? Because that's all we need. We don't need you to understand the ins and outs of the complexity. Is it meeting the criteria or not? And I think doing that is a different model of how projects get finance and funding, even in our community investment philanthropic system.
Testing. Okay, I'm going to stand up on this one. So I'm really going to ask you about new market tax credits, but let me filter back to this. My name's Ross Welch, Executive Director of Arcade Economic Development Corporation. We're a CDFI. I've been there 15 years after 30 years of banking in 3 of the counties that are here today. So what you described was exactly what we have gone through doing single projects, knockoff, and super satisfying, super intense, take a long time. And one was Hoopa, which was our biggest one, a grocery store on tribal land. We have two other CDFIs participating in that, a Humboldt Area Foundation, Headwaters Funds out of that was work, a capital stack, 3 loan committees. Oh, it's fun. Okay, so we've done this several times, but 2 of our other projects ended up with new market tax credits. One had historic tax credits. And as a CDFI, technically, we can apply for new market tax credits, but we're not that ginormous. But I looked at it over the years, it's like, oh, short version, it's really hard. But there's money in that and real equity. And so I looked at, we had like $50 million in projects, but even then it's like, since they're competitive, and if we don't get it that year, we just blew our money on it. And I can't do that with our size. However, with SURF and talking about this, and since we cover 4 of these counties here, do you think it would make sense for us to go through that work and apply for like $250 million in new market tax credits for all these potential projects? Because I can see people come up with these projects, the new market tax credits really bang for the buck. Yes, it's work.
Yeah.
I get sweaty just thinking how we went through some of those.
Yeah.
But we already unwound one downtown.
Yeah.
Unwound is after 8 years, you go through the whole thing and you get all that equity into it. It's real impact, and it can be used for housing, community facilities, and multi-use buildings. We could really take it to the next level. Is that worth us pursuing? That's my question.
I hesitate to give a direct answer to that. But it's funny that you bring up new market tax credits because I alternate between using the Iliad slide of a heroic journey, and then also putting up a new market tax credit deal with all of like the multiple investors and the multiple committees and the whole process that shows, it mirrors the heroic effort that I show with the Odyssey or the Iliad slide, because they are so complex. Having said that, they are now enough folks in the ecosystem. It's kind of like the low-income housing tax credit, which is the main vehicle that folks use to build multifamily housing in the United States, where initially it was really complex, it was really hard, and now it's become a whole industry unto itself, maybe to a fault, in terms of us just relying on that as the one tool to build affordable housing. So one thing about new market tax credits is it's moving in that direction where there's kind of a industry around providing support. 2 is we worked with folks in Los Angeles working with micro entrepreneurs, and then through a whole shared priority process, we're like, what we really want and need is to take a bunch of these properties off of the speculative market and own it, and develop this corridor and create a shared ownership model where community folks can buy into it, and the rents, folks with small businesses aren't threatened by rising rents every other year and are not sure if they're going to be able to stay or not. And they have used a new market tax credit to make that vision come to life in a way that only worked because they set up kind of the structure and the projects ahead of time and had a very good sense of what they were going to do. And then the vehicle becomes the vehicle, and then people like you work really hard to figure out the finances. But where new market tax credit deals have failed is not having a sense of where the projects are going to come from. So hesitate to give a direct answer. I've seen it worked really well as a tool, but also folks start out thinking about using one tool, and then when they have the projects and they look at them, they're like, maybe there are other tools that we should consider in multiple ways. And so it's another benefit of the pipeline approach is rather than starting from this is the strategy we're going to pursue, starting from this is where we want to get to, what are the tools that we can play with, and not tying ourselves to one from the beginning. New market tax credit might be the answer. There may be other simpler ways.
Thank you so much. Omar, thank you so much for being here today. I'm Jesus from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And first, I want to really quickly say something about capacity building. Capacity building has to be on both sides. Communities also have a lot of knowledge and expertise, and we need to honor that and elevate that. So as capacity building is offered, we need to be looking at both sides of the coin. My question to you is around how do we measure or track success in the projects that you ventured out to? Was that a conversation at the beginning, at the end? How did you all define what success looked like?
Yeah, I love the comment and the question. Part of the work that we do with these collaboratives is understanding and working with communities not as a monolith too, because that's often a part of the process where we get in trouble as well, because different communities, different neighborhoods have different needs, and finding the common course is part of what we need to, as stewards of the work, figure out how to navigate together with them. And then to your question about accountability, yes, part of having the concrete results and then having the pipeline, and what's neat about it is, one, it provides that accountability mechanism. So are the projects moving forward? What is it going to take? And then two is what are the effects of the enabling environment? Where else are we seeing things ease up because of the work that we're doing? So in Central Appalachia, where they saw that there was this need to create this storefront mechanism to attract capital, what they're now seeing is just by the mere fact of having this, folks are like, I don't know about any of those projects, but I'm talking to you. Where are there other projects that are more like this? And actually, I want to invest in those. And so that's having ripple effects. And so bringing that into thinking about outcomes, not just to the project move forward, but what are the other effects that we're seeing? Are folks collaborating more? So it's both the process and the projects themselves and the other enabling environment system changes that we're seeing. And in our initiatives, we track a number of those, and we help folks develop the mechanism to be able to track along those three dimensions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Omar,
Thank you all.
very much.